podcast. I'm Shashti Flor, journalist, Hollywood truth teller, and your voice of reason in a town built on delusion.
HI besties, welcome to Coravanta, YouTube channel. Blake Lively's ongoing legal battle has turned into one of the most complicated and controversial Hollywood courtroom dramas in recent memory. And as the case unravels piece by piece, it has started to reveal not only cracks in her strategy, but also troubling questions about the fairness of the system itself, the credibility of evidence being used, and the immense pressure on both sides to maintain a public image while simultaneously fighting for survival inside the courtroom. And when we look at the judge's decision to dismiss Jed Wallace from the case, the accusations of questionable tactics used by Lively's legal team to obtain critical text messages, and the glaring disparity in how Justin Baldoni has been treated compared to Lively, we begin to see a tangled web of alleged manipulation, legal maneuvering, and strategic missteps that may ultimately decide the outcome of the saga. The entire story begins with a startling revelation that Jed Wallace, head of street relations, a public relations figure who was accused of orchestrating a smear and retaliation campaign on Reddit and other platforms to target Lively's opponents, was dismissed from the lawsuit not because the accusations lacked weight, but because of a venue technicality, as the judge ruled that the alleged actions occurred in Texas and not in New York where the case was filed, a ruling that allowed Wallace to be removed from the proceedings without prejudice, meaning that Lively could still refile against him in Texas, but critically she was boxed in by the court's stipulation that she could not add new allegations or expand on her existing claims, essentially leaving her stuck with the evidence and narrative she had already presented, which, as the judge himself pointed out, had already been fully laid out on the table, creating a situation where her ability to strengthen her complaint was severely limited. And while at first glance this may have seemed like a small hiccup for her legal team, in reality it was a warning sign that her case might not be as structurally sound as initially believed, because in a courtroom strategy the ability to adapt, to expand, and to introduce fresh evidence or allegations can often mean the difference between victory and collapse. And here Lively was being forced into a corner where repetition and over-reliance on the same material could weaken her impact. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, Justin Baldoni was struggling with an entirely different problem, one that highlighted what many observers now describe as an unequal playing field, because while Lively was given the chance to amend her complaint and refile against Wallace, Baldoni had been repeatedly denied extended discovery opportunities, leaving him unable to properly access or analyze critical materials needed to defend himself and respond to allegations, a contrast that has not gone unnoticed by court watchers and legal commentators who have openly questioned why the system appears to be affording Lively more flexibility than Baldoni, with some even suggesting that this perceived imbalance could damage public trust in the fairness of the process itself. Because when one party is allowed to stretch the rules while the other is constrained by them, the optics become increasingly unfavorable. And it is this perception of bias that could shape not only the outcome in court, but also the narrative in the media, which has been following every twist of this high-profile battle. But perhaps the most explosive development in this entire saga comes from the question of how Lively's team actually obtained a trove of private text messages from Stephanie Jones's phone. Texts that have been described by insiders as central to her case, texts without which her allegations might lose significant weight. And yet the acquisition of these messages has been clouded by disturbing allegations that they may have been obtained through questionable, if not outright fraudulent means, with some reports suggesting the use of a fake subpoena or even a shell corporation to gain access. Tactics that, if proven true, would not only render the evidence inadmissible, but could also expose her legal team to serious accusations of abuse of process, fraud, or even illegality, raising the terrifying possibility that Lively's entire case could collapse under the weight of its own tactics. Critics like Popcorn Planet have not held back in voicing their outrage, bluntly describing the situation as shady as F, pointing out that if the court accepts illegally obtained evidence, it sets a dangerous precedent in the Second Circuit by signaling that anyone can manipulate the system, file a vague lawsuit, avoid naming parties or notifying them, and still walk away with private communications or documents, a loophole that would fundamentally erode trust in the integrity of the judicial process. And as Judge Lyman himself noted when compelling the production of certain communications from Vanzen, The relevance of whether or not Lively's side fraudulently obtained and laundered evidence cannot be ignored, because if proven it goes to the very heart of the case and could transform it from a battle of facts into a damning example of abuse of process. What makes this even more dramatic is the stark difference in how the court has treated Baldoni in comparison, because while Lively is alleged to have gone too far, possibly breaking the rules in her scramble for evidence, Baldoni has been restrained, boxed in, and denied access to even basic discovery tools, leaving him in the frustrating position of defending himself against a case that may have been bolstered by evidence obtained through questionable means, while being denied the opportunity to gather the evidence he needs to expose weaknesses in Lively's claims, and this has led many observers to question whether the court is inadvertently tilting the scales in Lively's favor, whether intentionally or not, and whether this imbalance could backfire by eroding public confidence in the outcome. Yet beyond the legal wrangling and the procedural disputes, the story is also one of perception, image, and the weaponization of public narratives, because as much as Lively's team accuses Jed Wallace of orchestrating a smear campaign through ghost accounts and online manipulation, others point out that the backlash against Lively was fueled by her own missteps, tone-deaf marketing choices, and prioritization of self-promotion over her film's success, choices that drew organic criticism and frustration from fans and media alike, criticism that could not simply be dismissed as manufactured by Wallace or anyone else, and in this sense her attempt to blame others for the tidal wave of negative sentiment risks sounding hollow, because the public's disapproval often came from real and observable actions, not fabricated narratives, and so what we are left with is a case that on the surface looks like a high-stakes legal battle between two Hollywood figures, but at its core reflects deeper systemic issues, questions about the fairness of discovery, the admissibility of evidence, the ethics of legal tactics, and the extent to which public perception can influence judicial proceedings. Because if the texts from Stephanie Jones are excluded, the heart of Lively's case may be gutted, but if they are admitted despite the allegations of fraudulent acquisition, it opens the door to an even larger scandal about how evidence can be laundered into the courtroom, and either way the credibility of the process itself is on trial. Baldoni's frustration is palpable. As he has openly voiced concerns about the lack of time and resources he has been given to counter allegations that have already spread through the media before he could respond, and his sense of being denied equal footing has resonated with observers who argue that justice is supposed to provide a fair shot for both sides, not tilt the board in favor of one party. And when you layer on top of this the fact that Lively has been allowed to refile against Wallace with restrictions, but still with flexibility, while Baldoni remains constrained, you create a narrative of imbalance that threatens to overshadow the merits of the actual claims themselves. The broader implications are enormous, because this is not just about Lively and Baldoni. This is about what kind of precedent the Second Circuit is willing to set, what kind of message is sent when evidence acquisition is questioned but tolerated, when one party is afforded more room than another, and when the court seems to treat allegations differently depending on who brings them. And in this sense the case has become bigger than its participants. A test of how the system handles high-profile disputes where fame, media scrutiny, and public opinion intersect with legal rules, and whether the integrity of the process can withstand the weight of celebrity influence and the temptation of shortcuts. The unanswered questions are what haunt this case the most. How exactly were Stephanie Jones's texts obtained? Who authorized the methods allegedly used? Were fake subpoenas or shell corporations truly involved, and was the importance of this evidence so great that Lively's team was willing to gamble on questionable legality to strengthen their position? And if so, what does that say about the foundation of her entire lawsuit? And can any verdict reached in such a case be trusted to reflect truth and justice rather than manipulation and expediency? And as these questions swirl, the frustration of Baldoni, the doubts about Wallace's role, the skepticism of the media, and the suspicions of the public combine into a storm that makes this one of the most dramatic legal sagas Hollywood has seen in years. A story where the outcome may determine not only the futures of the individuals involved but also the standards by which evidence and fairness are judged in the courtrooms of tomorrow. The scandal that erupted between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, amplified by the alleged manipulations of Jed Wallace, the mishandling of subpoenas, and the broader Hollywood machine that thrived on deception, became one of the most tangled legal and reputational dramas in recent memory. A story that exposed not just the fragility of celebrity image, but also the depth of systemic abuse in the entertainment industry's interplay with the courts, the press, and the public, because at its core it wasn't simply about one actress clashing with one director, but rather about the machinery of perception, the way evidence could be manufactured or discredited, the way PR narratives were treated almost like courtroom arguments, and how an industry built on glamour and charm could very quickly become a battlefield where reputations were torched, credibility was auctioned off, and truth itself became negotiable. The opening act of this long legal odyssey was defined by the sudden surfacing of supposed subpoenas tied to Jed Wallace's influence, documents that were later revealed to be riddled with irregularities, technical flaws, and questions of admissibility, raising immediate suspicion as to whether these subpoenas had ever been legitimately issued or whether they were carefully designed pressure tactics meant not for judicial enforcement but for psychological leverage. To create the illusion that Baldoni's side was cornered, an illusion that worked briefly in the echo chambers of online gossip before collapsing under judicial scrutiny, and when Judge Lyman examined the details, he didn't outright dismiss Wallace's moves, but he pointed to procedural abuse, recognizing that what Wallace's team called aggressive litigation often strayed dangerously close to coercion. And this moment marked the first crack in Blake Lively's broader PR shield, because while Wallace might have considered himself a mastermind of narrative warfare, his entire roadmap relied on the assumption that perception could be stretched indefinitely, that lies and leaks could drown out inconvenient truths. But the courtroom is not a red carpet interview nor a Vanity Fair profile. It has a memory, a transcript, and standards of evidence that cannot be brushed aside by spin. When the flaws in Wallace's tactics were noted, Freedman, the attorney guiding Lively's external narrative, tried to reframe the matter as a simple misunderstanding, but journalists who had already been fed Wallace's materials began to sense the contradictions, and suddenly what was meant to be a show of dominance looked more like desperation, a PR campaign dressing itself up as law, and at the same time Justin Baldoni's restrained, almost painfully cautious approach began to appear as the saner alternative, because while his camp lacked the megaphone that Lively and Reynolds' team enjoyed, they possessed patience and a growing archive of inconsistencies that would later become the bedrock of their credibility. And in Hollywood, credibility is a currency that burns slow but lasts long, and this was the subtle shift that many missed in the early months. The more Wallace overplayed his hand, the more Baldoni's quiet resolve gained weight, and soon industry insiders, from mid-tier producers to actors like James Brolin, started whispering about the imbalance. Why did one side seem so theatrical while the other so grounded? Why was one pushing gossip blogs while the other was stockpiling affidavits? And in this contrast lay the seeds of an empire's unraveling. Stephanie Jones, a lesser-known but increasingly central figure, entered this saga as a witness whose own role was compromised by her potential criminal exposure, because if Wallace's subpoenas were indeed illegitimate, if signatures had been forged or processes falsified, then Jones's participation in that chain made her vulnerable not just as a witness, but as a potential co-conspirator, and the legal concept of aiding and abetting hung over her like a shadow, a fact that Judge Lyman alluded to when he noted the discrepancies in her deposition. And though the press had not yet fully grasped the magnitude of what this meant, lawyers and legal commentators whispered about it in the background, recognizing that if the court ever allowed discovery into the authenticity of those documents, Jones's career and possibly her freedom could be jeopardized, and this legal sword hanging above her added another layer of instability to Lively's camp, because their witness strategy was suddenly riddled with risk, and the broader narrative of Blake as the wronged Hollywood star no longer sat comfortably against the reality that her legal surrogates were being questioned for procedural fraud. The public's attention, however, was slower to catch up, because for months the glossy headlines still favored Lively. Her appearances with Ryan Reynolds painted a picture of stability, of charm, of marital solidarity, but beneath the gloss cracks were widening. Media outlets that had previously run Lively statements unchallenged now inserted qualifiers like allegedly or reportedly, signaling the first break in blind support, and Baldoni's silence, mocked early on as weakness, began to be reframed as dignity, a refusal to sink into the tabloid mud. And while Lively still had millions of Instagram likes and fashion endorsements, These are fragile forms of power when the legal system begins to scrutinize your every move, because brands are allergic to scandal, investors to instability, and the longer the case dragged on, the less tenable her spotless image became. Wallace, who once believed he could dictate the narrative through platforms like Reddit, orchestrating swarms of posts and comments to create artificial consensus, soon found that online manipulation can only stretch so far before patterns emerge, and researchers, journalists, even rival PR specialists began tracing the fingerprints of coordination, noting how phrases repeated across threads, how accounts were suspiciously synchronized. And when investigative journalists started compiling dossiers on Wallace's tactics, the scandal shifted from being a story about Lively's grievance against Baldoni to a larger expose of how Hollywood weaponizes information, how online platforms are infiltrated by narrative engineers, and Wallace's name, once confined to backstage credits, became a subject of open scrutiny, his reputation eroding with each revelation. Judge Lyman, for his part, grew increasingly stern about the direction of the proceedings, warning both camps against theatrics but reserving his sharpest words for Wallace's submissions, noting inconsistencies and improper filings. And though he stopped short of sanctions, his tone alone was enough to signal that the court was not amused by what it perceived as gamesmanship, and this judicial posture emboldened Baldoni's lawyers, who began to prepare more aggressive motions for discovery, motions that threatened to expose the entire scaffolding of Wallace's strategy, including communications, drafts of subpoenas, and possibly the financial trail of who authorized what. And here lies the deeper risk for Lively. If discovery peeled back the curtain too far, it could show not just Wallace's overreach but complicity at higher levels, perhaps implicating Freedman, perhaps even reaching the edges of Lively's own knowledge. And while her defenders would insist she was shielded, a client guided by advisors, the court of public opinion rarely distinguishes between mastermind and participant. And once a celebrity's name is tied to fraud, nuance vanishes. What remains is the indelible stain of distrust. Stephanie Jones, meanwhile, attempted to recalibrate, presenting herself in later filings as a reluctant participant, a witness swept up in forces larger than herself. But lawyers are trained to spot narrative pivots, and Baldoni's side seized on these inconsistencies, preparing to corner her with her own contradictions, a strategy designed not to destroy her directly but to erode the credibility of everything she touched, because in law, as in storytelling, a single, unreliable narrator can collapse an entire narrative, and this was precisely the risk Lively faced. Her story was anchored in witnesses and advisors who could not withstand scrutiny, while Baldoni's was grounded in a slow accumulation of verifiable fact. As the months stretched into years, the legal battle metastasized into a cultural spectacle, Hollywood's press machinery circling like vultures over every filing, every leaked email, every stray comment, and within this spectacle the reputational costs skyrocketed. Lively, once considered untouchable in her marketability, began to face questions from brands about association risk. Journalists whispered that Reynolds privately fumed about the toll this was taking on their family image, and Baldoni, though bruised, though financially strained, found that his credibility was becoming his armor, his refusal to play dirty turning into a weapon. Because in a world drowning in spin, authenticity, or even the perception of authenticity, becomes gold. Wallace, cornered, tried to double down with more elaborate tactics, pushing for additional subpoenas, attempting to frame Baldoni's allies as biased or compromised, but every new move felt weaker, more transparent, less effective, and by the time rumors spread that an Omar testimony could further destabilize Lively's side, the balance of power had already shifted. Because what once looked like a controlled narrative now resembled a house of cards, trembling under the weight of its own contradictions. The cultural fallout of this case cannot be overstated, because it exposed the porous boundary between legal strategy and PR warfare, showing how Hollywood elites often believe they can treat courts like talk shows, where charm and spin suffice. But what the Lively Baldoni saga revealed is that transcripts don't forget, judges don't bend to Instagram, and manufactured perception eventually collides with hard fact, and in that collision reputations shatter, alliances dissolve, and careers that took decades to build can collapse in months. And so the story trudges on, with depositions looming, discovery battles intensifying, the specter of criminal exposure haunting secondary figures like Jones, Wallace's career in ruins, Freedman scrambling to salvage a narrative no longer under his control, and at the center Blake Lively, once the golden face of effortless elegance, now trapped in a war she cannot style her way out of, a war where every tactic backfires, every ally crumbles, and every truth buried beneath spin claws its way to the surface, until the inevitable reckoning arrives, in court or in culture, where Hollywood finally learns that lies may dazzle for a season, but in the cold memory of transcripts and the harsh light of credibility, they wither, leaving only the wreckage of a star who flew too close to the machinery of deceit and found herself consumed by the very narrative she sought to control. Thanks for watching. Subscribe our channel Coravanta. Goodbye Tata besties.